Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you so much for joining me today on episode 78 of Untold Evidence. Now, today I'm going to go through a little bit of everything that we've talked about so far on this channel. We've gone through so much. It's been a little bit chaotic. It's been so interesting, and I hope at times it's been enlightening. Now we're going to pull together some of the storylines and try and make some cohesive sense of it all. I clearly can't do this in one episode. For those of you that have seen me do the reaction series, I do 3 episodes on a one podcast content's worth. So nearly every single reaction episode has been on a podcast from around 2.5 to 4 hours, and we're making an hour and a half of content on that because there is obviously so much to talk about. So these sort of recaps and directional roadmaps of theory will come more and more. And hopefully as the channel progresses, you guys get to see more and more of my philosophical approach. I do not pretend to be a philosopher in any way, but I have a keen interest in the subject, as well as the facts, archaeology, anthropology, astrology. All of this stuff is incredibly interesting, and I'm sure you guys find it interesting too. That's why you're here. So today, every thread this channel has pulled so far tied together in one place: the crashes, the cover-ups, the nuclear bases, the corporate vaults, the whistleblowers who swore under oath, the memo that was never supposed to exist, the money, Heather Lynn, follow the money, that vanished from the books, the deadlines, and 4 months from now, what could blow the whole structure open. Some of these stories will get 10 minutes tonight. Some will get 90 seconds and a promise because they deserve their own episode, and they'll get them. But by the end, and hopefully it will wrap this up in around 45 minutes, I apologize if it's a bit longer, you will hold the entire shape of the biggest secret in modern history in your head at once. And once you see the shape, I don't think you can unsee it. A warning before we start, because this channel doesn't sell certainty. Everything you're about to hear sits in one of 3 baskets: documented fact with paperwork you can read yourself, sworn testimony, which is evidence, the evidence that you have to weigh, and claims which are neither, and will be labelled as exactly that. I'll tell you which basket we're going into, and at the end the skeptics get their floor at full strength because they always have a case. So you ready? Let's start before World War II. The year is 1933, a year up until a year ago I thought had no significance whatsoever, and now I'm starting to think otherwise. We're in northern Italy, and according to the testimony given to Congress and the American investigative journalist by intelligence whistleblower David Grusch, something came down near the town of Magenta, outside Milan. Not an aircraft anyone could name. Grusch says the fascist government of Benito Mussolini recovered it, stored it, and studied it under a secret body, and that the Vatican was well aware. He says that in 1944 and 45, as the war ended, the United States got hold of it, which would mean the American crash retrieval story doesn't start where you think it starts. It started 14 years before Roswell, with a craft passed between governments like a stolen painting. Now that's basket 3, a claim, but it's also a claim made by a decorated intelligence officer on the record under the penalty of perjury when repeated to Congress. So the Magenta Files gets its own full episode later this year, but tonight it's the opening move, because 14 years later comes the day everything went public and then unpublic in under 24 hours. July the 8th, 1947. The Roswell Army Airfield, home of the only atomic bomb squadron on Earth, that's a very important and interesting fact, puts out an official press release, and the words in it, from the United States military itself, said they had recovered a flying disc. Hours later, a second statement. It was a weather balloon. The photographs are staged, the debris swapped, the story dead. For 47 years, that was that, until 1994, when the Air Force admitted the balloon story was false and replaced it with a third story, a classified program called Mogul. 3 official explanations for one afternoon. Documented fact. And there's a face on that story. Major Jesse Marcel, the intelligence officer sent to collect the debris, was photographed holding weather balloons, scraped together for the cameras. And he stayed silent for 3 decades. Then, near the end of his life, he said it plainly. The material in the photos was not the material he picked up on the field. He described foil that returned to shape when crushed and beams that would not burn. He said he was ordered to pose with the substitutes. Now, maybe that's an old man misremembering. Maybe the first officer on the scene of the most famous crash in history spent 30 years being the only man in America who knew the punchline was real. Now, both versions cost something to believe. Whatever fell at Roswell, the paperwork proves one thing beyond argument. The government's very first instinct on the subject was to say something true, panic, and then replace it with something false. I urge and beg you to give me examples of that in modern democratic governments over the last 100 years. I think you'll find many. The Mandela effect. And Roswell has a sibling, December the 9th, 1965. Thousands of people across 6 American states and Canada watch a fireball cross the sky. Something comes down in the woods outside Kecksburg, Pennsylvania. Witnesses describe an acorn-shaped object the size of a car with markings like no alphabet that they knew of. And then they describe something stranger. The United States military arriving within hours, cordoning the woods and driving away with a covered flatbed truck. The official record says nothing was found. The witnesses say they watched the nothing get loaded onto the truck. NASA later admitted to examining the fragments from the area and then said the records were lost. How unfortunate. I'm sure it's just a coincidence. A federal judge, decades later, ordered searches that came back empty. Basket 2. Witness testimony stacked against a documented military response to officially nothing at all. And then, January the 20th, 1996, Varginha, Brazil. The case they call the Brazilian Roswell. 3 young women walking home in daylight report a creature crouched by a wall. Brown, oily skin, oversized head, red eyes. In the days around it, other residents report the same thing. The Brazilian military floods the town, hospitals receive unusual patients under guard, and a young military policeman who allegedly handled the creature barehanded is dead within weeks from a sudden infection. The official explanation is shifted between a mentally ill local man, a drainage story, and as ever, silence. Decades later, witnesses, including military personnel, keep their accounts and keep crying when they give them. Now, this channel's Virginia episode is going to come within the crash retrieval series, as there are lots of crash retrievals across the last sort of 80 years within, I would say, a more acknowledged form of UFO research. However, we'll go back even further because Giorgiani himself will say that there's inscriptions in ancient Egyptian and ancient Sumerian. And I believe he says that there are, let's say, interpretations that there was UFOs in the cave of Muhammad. So that's a quick and brief, at least for now, bit on the crash era. Now watch what the officialdom built to contain it, because that is just important. In January 1953, the CIA convened a panel of scientists in secret, the Robertson Panel. Its report, which again sat classified for years and is now sitting in a public government repository, at least of last month, concluded the phenomenon itself was less dangerous than the public interest in it. And its recommendations was not more investigation. It was a debunking campaign. Use the media, use ridicule, train the public to laugh at these reports so they dry up. Tier 1, documented fact. In the CIA's own pages released by the CIA's own government. They even had data telling them that laughter was a lie. The Air Force Commissioner Battelle, Memorial Institute to statistically analyze every Blue Book case on record, 3,201 cases. The result, Special Report number 14, found 22% could not be identified. And it found that the unknowns didn't shrink as report quality improved. They grew. The best witnesses, the best data, the most unexplainable cases. The Air Force's press release announcing the study claimed the opposite of what it contests. Again, documented. Tier 1. The receipts exist. And since last month, they exit on a Pentagon website. The machine got one more upgrade before it went quiet. In the late 1960s, the Air Force needed an exit, so it funded a university study, the Condon Committee, whose 1969 report concluded further study was again not justified. Blue Book closed on that verdict, but read the report itself, as researchers did, and you'll find that roughly a third of its own case studies remained unexplained, including some of the reports authors labelled as defying analysis. The conclusion and the contents disagree with each other in the same binder. The conclusion made from the newspapers, the contents made this channel. And with Blue Book closed, the official position of the United States government, held for the next half a century, became this: we do not investigate, which, as declassified files kept later proving, was never true for a single day. So that's the machine: deny, ridicule, manage. Now, here's the question that the machine was built to stop you asking. What were these things actually doing? Because when you plot the serious cases on a map, they aren't random. They cluster around one thing. I'm not going to be the first person to say it. The thing they cluster around are nuclear weapons. So March the 16th, 1967, Malmstrom Air Force Base, Montana, Captain Robert Salas is 60 feet underground in a launch control capsule with a flight of Minuteman nuclear missiles. Topside security calls down in a panic, describing a glowing red object hovering at the front gate. And as Salas listens, his missiles start dropping offline, one after another. 10 nuclear weapons dead in their silos. With guidance and control failures, the Air Force could not replicate afterwards. That's bonkers. Salas had told this story under oath, most recently to journalists and researchers this decade, and boards of inquiry documented the shutdowns, sworn testimony sitting on top of documented equipment failure. We can move forward to December 1980. RAF Bentwaters and Woodbridge, England. American servicemen follow lights into Rendlesham Forest. On 2 separate nights, we've done a video on this, and describe a triangular craft on the ground. The Deputy Base Commander, Lieutenant Colonel Charles Holt, walks into the woods with a tape recorder, and his audio and his official memo to the Ministry of Defence exist today. This was a nuclear-capable base. The senior officer put it in writing. Tier 1 documented, Tier 2 for what they described. And if you think that pattern belongs to the Cold War, listen to what the United States Congress heard just months ago. In September 2025, Air Force veteran Jeffrey Nucatelli testified about Vandenberg Air Base, home of the missile defense between 2003 and 2005. 2 years, 5 separate incidents. Boeing contractors reported a massive glowing red square hovering silently over 2 missile defense sites during the most important launch window in 25 years. Witnessed by multiple personnel, documented and reported up the chain. And from the chain, silence. Add in October 1968, the Minot Air Force Base, North Dakota, where a B-52 crew tracked an object on airborne radar while missile security teams reported it on the ground near the silos. An incident so well documented that the radar scope photographs survive in the archive. We can also add in the Soviet mirror, because declassifying accounts from the other side of the Cold War describe exactly the same patterns at their weapons facilities, including a reported 1982 incident at a Ukrainian base where a launch system allegedly activated on their own while an object hovered above. Two superpowers, one phenomena, and it is consistent, decade-long interest in the most dangerous object our species has ever created. Nuclear weapons, missile defense, strategic sites. Decade after decade, the same address book. The full nuclear connection is an 8-part series on this channel, which again we will do later in the year. But tonight, hold the pattern. Ask yourself the question every general must ask in private. If something is inspecting your nuclear arsenal and you cannot stop it, do you tell the public or not? Or does the ridicule machine start to look to you like mercy, like a way out? So stop and breathe for a sec. We're halfway there, and there's a lot of information that we've covered. Look what's already on the table just using the boring tiers. A military that announced a flying disc, retracting it within hours. A CIA panel that prescribed ridicule as policy. A statistical study whose own numbers contradicted its press release. A closure report whose own cases contradicted its conclusion. And a nuclear weapons facilities all across the world in 2 rival superpowers across 6 decades reporting the same uninvited visitor. Now you can reject every claim in tonight's third basket, every crash, every whistleblower, every memo, and you're still left holding on to this. The institution lied provably, repeatedly in writing about one subject they insisted was nothing. Nothing here requires a 70-year information strategy. Now we go where the files went, because the deepest part of this story isn't in the sky at all, it's in the filing system. America protects its most sensitive projects with something called a special access program. Ordinary classification has levels. A special access program has a door with no handle. Clearance alone gets you nothing. You must be read in by name, and to even ask, you genuinely need to know a code whose existence is itself top secret. So this January, a witness told in Congress, in effect, the lawmakers would need the code word just to request a briefing. That's the government side. Now add the corporate side. Freedom of information law binds agencies. It does not bind contractors. Move a program into private aerospace company, Lockheed Martin perhaps, and the same file that a journalist could eventually pry out of a government vault becomes legally unreachable indefinitely. Journalist George Knapp, who I'm adamant everyone on this channel has seen before and heard before, has told Congress this is precisely what happened decades ago, and the few people inside the government even remember where the material went. The vault, in other words, isn't Area 51, it's behind a corporate legal department. In 2002, if one disputed document is real, the vault turned away an admiral. The document is known as the Wilson Memo. It surfaced in 2019 amongst the papers of the late astronaut Edgar Mitchell, and it reads as the private meeting notes of physicist Eric Davis describing on October 2002 a conversation with Vice Admiral Thomas Wilson, former head of the Defense Intelligence Agency. In the notes, the Admiral describes discovering in the late 1990s a special access program run inside a contractor facility dealing with a recovered craft not made by human hands. And when the man who ran the defense intelligences for the United States asked to read in, the program's gatekeepers, private employees, told him, "Not today, Chief." He had the clearance, he had the stars on his shoulder, he did not have the code word, and the corporate security officer showed him the door. The notes go further. They describe the program managers telling the Admiral the craft was, in their own words, as recorded, not made by human hands. They describe a gatekeeping committee inside the corporation deciding who gets to know, and they describe the aftermath. The Admiral, one of the most senior intelligence officers in the United States, being advised to drop the matter or lose his career, and choosing, in the notes account, to walk away angry and stay silent for years until a private conversation with a physicist put it all on paper. Admiral Wilson has publicly denied the meeting ever happened. Eric Davis has never disowned the notes and has confirmed to journalists that he stands by his words on these topics. Now, it's tier 3, a claim, and amongst the most consequential claims in the entire subject. But if those 15 pages are real, congressional oversight of the most important discovery in human history ended in a contractors' conference 27 years ago. The Wilson Memo gets a full forensic episode on its own, but today it gets to sit there, quite radioactive, in the middle of this story. Meanwhile, out in the Utah desert, the government's curiosity never actually died. In 2007, at the request of Senator Harry Reid, the Pentagon quietly funded a $22 million program through billionaire Robert Bigelow, studying advanced aerospace threats and, on the side, a ranch in Utah with a folklore file thicker than a phone book. Out of that world came the AATIP, the Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program, and a Pentagon intelligence officer named Louis Elizondo, who ran it, Tier 1. The program, the money, and the paper trail are confirmed and reported by the New York Times. Now, I have a Louis Elizondo reaction 3-part series scripted. I think the interview was maybe last year. Since then, I have heard a lot that he could be an inside plant, someone there to help manage the release of disclosure. So I'm going to actually rewrite that reaction season and maybe take a different content form from it. Maybe that podcast wasn't the best because, as we all know here, the intelligence officials are riddled in every area of all human life. I think it was the CIA that even tweeted once, doctors, nurses, garbage men, all these people have links to intelligence agencies. So I read Louis Elizondo a lot. Over the last couple of weeks, I'm a little bit more worried about his professional and intellectual integrity, at least in terms of whose side he's on. But for now, let's just leave that there. We'll get back to him in full at a different time. But this does bring us to the night the modern era began, November the 14th, 2004. Love this story. Off the coast of Southern California. The Nimitz, the carrier strike group, for 2 weeks, the most advanced radar in the US Navy, had been tracking objects going from 80,000 feet in the air to sea level in seconds. I'm sure everyone knows this guy, but Commander David Framer, if you haven't heard this story before of the Tic Tac, you must go and research it. Now, I personally think now it's human tech reverse engineered, but this is one of the original stories that got me to the point of something's going wrong. It's actually the story that I cite when I talk about physics with my friends, that gravity cannot be the only answer because gravity cannot explain this. Whether it is human or non-human, gravity doesn't explain this story. So David Fravor, squadron leader of the Black Aces, is set to intercept it. What he finds is a white object shaped like a breath mint, 40 feet long, no wings, no exhaust, no rotors, moving over a churning patch of ocean. When he descends towards it, it mirrors him, and then it accelerates and gone. Then it reappears seconds later at the pilot's secret rendezvous point, 60 miles away. It knew where they were going. Fravor has said it publicly. It was the strangest thing he's ever seen, and he has repeated every word of it under oath to Congress. The sensor operation who tracking it back him. The infrared footage exists, released by the Pentagon itself as genuine. That is Tier 1 footage of a Tier 1 testimony. Tier 2 is what it means. But the Tic Tac already has its full anatomy episode on this channel. Go and watch it and go and read more about it. I think even in that episode, I didn't quite highlight my recent views of it. I think my view really has changed. That to me, it's far more likely it's a test of reverse engineered tech that the US military did than anything else. But even if we take it at sort of conspiracy value that it is non-human tech that was testing our pilots, it's bonkers. It goes from 80,000 feet, and I think that has been challenged. I think some readings say it's 50,000 feet, and I'll happily say 50,000 feet to try to keep it as true, if that's the right word, as possible. But regardless, it is moving distances and speeds that our known physics cannot explain. And the Tic Tac wasn't a one-off either. So from 2014 onwards, Navy pilots flying upgraded radar off the American East Coast began detecting objects daily, not annually, daily. Lieutenant Ryan Graves, an F-18 pilot, I think he's been on Rogan, has since testified to Congress, despite objects holding positions stationary in hurricane forces at altitude, staying aloft for 12 hours or more, that is far beyond, I think, any drone endurance as of 2026, let alone 2014. And doing it inside a military training aerospace is bonkers. Now, I don't know what you guys have heard. I've heard people say that military tech is anywhere between 20 and 500 years more advanced than sort of the public gets to receive and use. So I guess this could be a military drone that is just so far advanced. They were testing it back then. I truly don't know. What I do know is it defies the law of physics. If I'm wrong on that, and there is an incredibly intelligent physics teacher in the chat, please tell me why I'm wrong that it doesn't adhere to our current laws of physics. Also in 2014, two jets flew so close to the one that the flight lead cancelled the mission and an official safety report was filed. So out of that era came two videos that the Pentagon later confirmed as genuine, and the Pentagon is confirming it as a genuine. Do I think that is official? I don't know, but it's the best we've got. It's known by their file names, Go Fast and Gimbal, and the second showing an object rotating on its axis while aircrew on the audio ask each other what the hell is going on. Graves say the reporting system was so broken and the stigma so thick that the pilots seeing these things weekly simply stopped filing them. And then think about what that means. The most instrumented airspace on the planet and the sensors in the aircraft agreeing something was there, but the culture said, do and say nothing. This is the very tip of science at the time, and the culture within these programs says just ignore it. I have no explanation for that. Like, that is just crazy. Like, that is sinister. Am I correct? Do we think that's sinister? So in December 2017, the New York Times put the ATIP, Fravor, and 3 Navy videos on its front page. And then the ridicule machine built in 1953 finally jammed. Pilots started talking. Congress started writing UAP provisions into law, and the Pentagon had to confirm the videos are real. And watch how the law changed, because the legal record is the basket all the way down. This is how we can only class Tier 1 from the legal, or not only. This is one of the major ways we can class Tier 1 as a documented record. And in 2020, the Senate Intelligence Committee ordered a UAP task force to report it. 2021, the government published its first public UAP assessment in half a century. So we went from ridiculing it to admitting it was real. And I think a lot of conspiracy theories joke that what is a conspiracy theory today, 6 months down the line, will be confirmed. Well, it took the UAP scenario 50 years to get that confirmed. But it also had to admit it could not explain the majority of its cases. Fast forward to 2022, Congress mandated a permanent office, and it held its first open hearing on the subject in 54 years. 2023, the Senate Majority Leader himself, Chuck Schumer, put forward legislation modeled on the JFK Records Act, using phrases no Senate leader had ever attached to this subject, technologies of unknown origin and non-human intelligence, as well as proposing that any recovered technology held by private entities be subject to eminent domain. Kind of nuts, because Lockheed are not opening their doors over yet. The United States government asserting the right to seize UFO material from corporations. Again, not seeing any Lockheed content come out. The bill's enforcement teeth, the Independent Review Board, and the subpoena powers were stripped in negotiation, and the men who stripped them were never fully named. The strongest disclosure law ever written died in a back room. Interesting. Anyone with Lockheed Martin connections here? Its authors called out defense contractors on the Senate floor, And remember that when we get to what the Senate is doing right now, and then in June 2023, the dam cracked. So we go to David Grusch once more, a decorated Afghanistan veteran intelligence officer with the Natural Geospatial Intelligence Agency and the National Reconnaissance Office, a man who was briefed at the level of presidential daily intelligence. He served on the government's own UAP task force, and he came out saying that while doing the job, he was told that a multi-decade program to retrieve and reverse engineer crash craft hidden from Congress, funded by money misappropriated from other budget lines. This is nuts, and to me, the only way this thing could happen. He named locations, programs, and people to the Intelligence Community Inspector General, whose office found his complaint credible and urgent. We've done an episode on this. Those are the Inspector General's words, not mine. In 2023 July, Grusch said all over again, under oath, on camera in a public hearing. Asked whether the government had the remains of pilots, he said biologics and had been recovered. Asked if they were human, he answered that the assessment of the people with direct knowledge was they were non-human. This is all under oath in Congress. Now, it has to be tier 2 because it is only sworn testimony, and it's from a witness the system itself certified as credible before the public ever heard his name. He didn't stay alone either. By September 2025, the chairwoman of a congressional task force stated that 34 senior military, government and intelligence officials had broken silence on this subject. A list, she said, included a serving Secretary of State, senators from both parties, a former Director of National Intelligence and a former Secretary of Defense. In November 2024, journalist Michael Schellenberger entered into the congressional record the alleged code name of the current umbrella program collecting UAP data outside oversight, Immaculate Constellation. According to the report, Schellenberger submitted, based on what he described as a current or former official's disclosure, it is the umbrella special access program that has been quietly collecting the military's best UAP evidence for years. High quality imagery, sensor data, videos, organized and analyzed entirely outside of congressional knowledge. Now, if that is true, then every time an official told Congress the data was too sparse to conclude anything, a better library existed down the hall. The Pentagon says no such program exists. Of course they do. The name now sits in the permanent record of the United States Congress waiting. Now that one will get its own episode too, because it is kind of nuts that somehow a journalist has found the code name for this and he is still being shut out. The hearings kept escalating. September 2025, a congressional task force built specifically for declassifying federal secrets held its first UAP session, and it opened with something no hearing had ever done. It played new footage, an American MQ-9 Reaper drone in an active combat zone firing a Hellfire missile at a fast-moving metallic orb. The missile strikes, or at least seems to, but the orb just keeps going. George Knapp, the journalist who worked at this subject for 40 years, watched it enter the record, summed it up in a question. What the hell is that? The first publicly acknowledged weapon engagement between the United States military and an unidentified object. And the object won. And on that same hearing, an Air Force veteran named Dylan Borland, we've also done an episode on, testified to standing under a massive triangular craft at Langley Air Force Base in 2012. So close, he says, its field interfered with his phone. He told lawmakers that even then they would need a compartmented code word to be briefed on what it was. Another witness, a serving Navy senior chief, described transmedium objects, things that move from air to water without slowing down, were tracked by ship sensors. Now, that word transmedium now appears in the government's own official definitions because the law had to invent language for the objects that treat the ocean and the sky as exactly the same substance. Now, what's under the water? Again, its own episode. A retired rear admiral, a former head of the Navy's own Oceanography Command, has said publicly that the ocean encounters are real, the data exists, and it is being withheld. So when oceanographers start sounding the alarm, it's probably time to take note. And then there's a testimony that arrived like a message in a bottle. Harold Malmstrom was an advisor whose service reached across 4 presidential administrations, a man with decades of access at the very highest level of American defense policy. Near the end of his life, he gave a recorded interview describing deep compartmentalization, confirming in his account long-running retrieval programs, and saying disclosure was inevitable and overdue. In his final public statement, he went further still, writing that after the high-altitude nuclear tests of 1962, he was briefed by a senior official on what the official called other-world technologies, and that knowledge had been held inside a need-to-know lattice so tight that even some presidents received fragmentation. So not even the presidents are fully briefed on this. So a man with nothing left to gain, no book to sell, no career to protect, choosing to put that on record with the time he had left. 2 weeks after the recording, he passed away. His daughter, an economist and former presidential advisor herself, has since raised a darker question in public at a Washington forum just days ago about a string of scientists connected to the research who had died or disappeared. I'm sure you guys have heard about that story. We've got to do an episode on that as well, and whether the pattern is really a coincidence. Are we believing in coincidences at this point? So it is annoyingly tier 2 because it's a deathbed testimony, and then it's tier 3 about the clearly labelled as such missing scientist question. But scientists have gone missing. Both get full episodes, but today is just a candle in that window. Now, shall I quote once more Dr. Heather Lynn? Follow the money, because the money is where the claims become the most checkable. The Pentagon never passed a full financial audit. I mean, that is bonkers in itself. Imagine me and you trying to say we can't pass a financial audit. We get our asses thrown in jail so quick. Pentagon, though, no problem. So not once since the department-wide audits began in 2018, nearly 10 years, trillions of dollars of assets it cannot fully account for year after year in the official audit reports. That is tier 1. Grusch's sworn claim is that this fog is not entirely accidental, that funds were appropriated for one purpose and they've been diverted to a program Congress has never heard of. Academic researchers examining Department of Defense financial statements have documented trillions, trillions of dollars in what the auditors call unsupported journal adjustments. Bookkeeping entries with no traceable documentation behind them, year after year. Now, it's not the same as trillions of missing cash, and I'm not going to pretend it is. However, for a government, or any government, to not be able to, honestly, in this day and age, realistically tell your spending to the pound, I do find that somewhat worrying and suspicious. But it is something more useful to a hidden program than missing cash. It's a ledger in which nothing can be definitively found, which means nothing can be definitively missed. Add the mechanism Grusch described under oath, money appropriated for program, a quietly executed program, and the fact that when the ATIP own backers tried to give it a special access protection in 2009, the request was denied and the program left to wither. And if the whistleblowers were right, the real program sat untouched behind the code words the entire time. An unaccountable ledger is not proof of hidden program, but a hidden program would require exactly this kind of ledger. The full money trail, that black budget, the audits, the misappropriation mechanism, again, we'll do our own episode on it because it's huge. So briefly, the crazy shelf. The claims at the outer edge, and I'm not going to pretend I'm adjudicating it tonight, I'm just going to try and log it. Claims from multiple recent whistleblowers and researchers that some programs have explored psionic methods, human consciousness itself, as an interface to the phenomenon. Claims that the government's remote viewing programs, Stargate, which is a documented fact and ran for 2 decades, was closer to the subject than its files admit, and I still find that completely bonkers to say out loud. Claims about the Vatican's long awareness reaching back to the field in Italy in 1933. Claims about non-human biologics in contractor custody. There are catalogues of claims from journalists and self-described program insiders that the recovery numbers, not one or two, but a dozen or more craft of different kinds in different states of repair, held at different contractor sites within the most radioactive versions of the claim, their occupants are preserved alongside them. Now, no document supports that publicly, but multiple named people have still said it, some of them under oath in the general form, and the specific numbers get their own episode when and only when there's something checkable to hang them on. Now, there's a man this entire genre orbits, the one and only Bob Lazar, who claimed in 1989 that he worked on a recovered craft at a site called S4 near Area 51, and he described a fuel source science hasn't catalogued, as well as naming the element's atomic number years before the element was synthesized in a laboratory. His critics said his credentials dissolved under checking. His defenders say they were erased. Both can't be right, and that episode is coming as well. We've done a bit on Bob Lazar. I love the Bob Lazar story. He's in the last year or two being thrown out, whether that's by his choice or others. It is at least interesting. He stayed relatively quiet on the public screen and during this disclosure is coming out, whether that is to back up disclosure, whether he is an informant in himself, I don't know. I want to believe his story. I want to hold it in totality. But again, with like all of this, we just need more evidence. There's also the ranch in Utah, Skinwalker, where a billionaire's research team and later a Pentagon-funded program both documented in their own accounts phenomena that make the flying disc look boring. The government studied a haunted ranch with defense money. That sentence is tier 1. What they found there is tier 3, and that'll get a full episode in due course. But each of these sentences are incredible. They're a future episode and series in themselves. They're going to stay on the shelf for now, labeled visible and at times unproven. But that's how the channel wants to work. So this brings us to the right now, because 2026 is the year the structure started moving. In February, a presidential order created Pursue, a rolling declassification program with a public repository. Since May, 3 trenches have landed, 162 files in the first alone, gun camera footage from the F-16 that shot down an unidentified object over Lake Huron in 2023, 17 minutes of infrared showing objects in formation over the Persian Gulf, FBI authenticated orb videos over the northeastern United States, the Robinson Panel report, buried statistics republished by the government that buried them again, and a 1971 Allied intelligence assessment cited by Grusch concluding the official debunking of this serious official interest. Now sit with this for a second. The Lake Huron footage matters most because in February 2023, an American fighter jet shot something down over the Great Lakes on the president's order, and the public was never told what it was. The wreckage was never recovered, and the story was allowed to die. The gun camera film of the engagement is now on the government server, and buried in the second level of it is a written account from 2025 by a serving senior intelligence officer, described in an hour-long observation of an orange orb that left them, in their own words, virtually speechless. It's not a retiree, it's not a legend from 1967. A serving officer this decade inside an official release. The 1971 assessment, known as the Turner Report, closes the loop on everything this episode has told you, because in it, an Allied intelligence service concludes that some of the objects matched no known aircraft, and that official debunking was masking official interest. The 2-track system, public ridicule and private study, written down by professionals in 1971 and then published by the Pentagon in 2026. And if you want the full tour of those files, this channel's emergency episodes on Pursue is linked below, and we also have a playlist on it, so please do go check that out. The whistleblower era isn't history either. On June the 9th, 2026, David Grusch was back at Capitol Hill giving further testimony, and 2 days later came reporting of whistleblower alleging billions in secret spending on these programs. In late June, Washington hosted a public disclosure forum where senators from intelligence committees shared a stage with the whistleblowers their own committees are hearing from, and the keynote came from Christopher Mellon, the former Pentagon intelligence official who hand-delivered the original Navy videos to the New York Times, telling the room that anything recovered with taxpayers' money belongs to the taxpayer, a very reasonable position to hold. Now, the gap between the fringe and the establishment, which was Canyon in 2016, is now a doorway. At the same time, the United States Senate did something with no precedent in the entire 90-year history. The Intelligence Committee issued subpoenas not to agencies, but to private defense contractors believed to hold the legacy programs. The corporate vault subpoenaed. Multiple cleared witnesses are already coming forward through the lawyers. At least one major contractor, the Minot Corporation, has reportedly moved towards compliance, and the next pursuit scheduled for November is tied directly to the subpoena deadline. So if the contractors comply, that release is expected to include records for special access programs held outside of government oversight, potentially the most significant declassification in the history of the entire subject. If they refuse, the United States Senate and American defense industry go to war in public over it. There is no third outcome, and there are 4 months left on the clock. Now, even Hollywood is picking their side of this story. A documentary called The Age of Disclosure has put sitting officials on the record, including a Secretary of State, saying that even the presidents have operated on a need-to-know basis that just spun out of control, and a senator saying it is not acceptable to have parts of a government no elected official ever sees. When this channel reacts to the film in full, and we will, you'll hear those words in context, and they do not get any smaller. And understand what's actually at stake in November, because it's bigger than the vindication for witnesses. If recovered technology exists inside the corporate vaults, it was recovered, transported, stored and studied with public money, which is Christopher Mellon's blunt point. It legally and morally belongs to the people who paid for it. Energy, propulsion, materials, the kind of physics that doesn't upgrade an economy but replaces it. Now that's the optimistic version. The other version is the one the secrecy has always implied, that whatever was learned was judged too destabilizing to share for markets, for religion, for the simple human need to feel like they are top of the food chain. This is a conundrum that we speak a lot about on this channel. At the Washington Forum in June, panels debated exactly these questions, economists and clergy, alongside intelligence officials. And the notable thing was that nobody argued. Nobody argued the public couldn't handle it. And the polling says people want the truth and expect to survive it. The institutions holding the truth are the only ones still frightened of it. And that says a lot in itself. And now, as promised, the skeptics get the floor at the fullest strength that we can possibly muster. And here is the case, and it's a serious one. In 90 years, not one artifact has ever been produced, not one alloy on a lab bench, not one photograph that survives analysis, not one body despite thousands of people supposedly touching this material across 8 decades. An impossible secret for fallible humans to keep. Grusch, by his own account, never saw a craft himself. His testimony is secondary. 40 interviews of other people's stories, and the Inspector General finding his complaint credible speaks to procedure, not to aliens. The Wilson Memo is unsigned, and notes even the Admiral himself calls fiction. The Tic Tac could censor artifacts wrapped in honest human misinterpretation. The nuclear shutdown have candidate explanations in equipment failure. Roswell was plausibly exactly what the 1994 report said, a classified balloon array for detective Soviet tests. And the modern wave, the skeptics argue, is a mythology feeding itself. Whistleblowers repeating a legend that intelligence services may have planted in the first place, because a UFO rumour is the perfect camouflage for a stealth program. Even George Knapp, the subject's most dogged journalist, told Congress it is entirely possible some of this is a psyop. I would have to agree. The government's own investigation office has reported repeatedly that it has found no verifiable evidence of non-human technology and that most cases resolve into balloons, drones and clutter. On this reading, pursuers are pressure management, releasing the strange but inconclusive, while the crash retrieval category sits conveniently timeline free forever. And the skeptics have skeptics, not just posture. Independent analysts argues that gimbal, the object's rotation matches a glare artifact rotating inside the camera's gimbal mechanism, not a craft rotating in the sky. They argue go fast dramatic speed is a parallax illusion over the ocean, and that the math supports a slow-moving object in the wind. The Pentagon's investigative office published a historical review in 2024, reporting that decades of claims trace back, in its telling, to misidentified ordinary programs, garbled second-hand stories, and a small circle of believers citing each other in loops. Its former director has said the real story is how mythology captures institutions, and the sociology argument has teeth. Every generation's unexplained objects have looked suspiciously like the next generation's classified aircrafts. This is really important. I find this a real difficult circle to square. From the U-2 era, when the Air Force privately credited its own spy planes with a large share of significant sightings while publicly saying nothing, to today's drone swarms. On this reading, the whole 90-year arc is a hall of mirrors, America built around its own black projects, and the whistleblowers and sincere men describing reflections. So I would say here that I think it is highly likely that part of this story is human engineered tech. Whether that's reverse engineered is a different story. I can't remember who said it, but I've seen it a few times. The assumption that military tech is 20 to 50 years, sometimes hundreds of years ahead of the public. So I can absolutely see a world where we could have reverse engineered it from the Bob Lazar storyline, but a lot of what we see now probably is human tech. So all these cases deserves respect, and we'll add one more thing, it deserves November. Because for the first time in 90 years, the skeptical hypothesis and the cover-up hypothesis make different predictions about a specific, dated public event. If there was nothing in the corporate vaults, the subpoena will come back empty. And the mythology explanations get stronger than it has ever been. If there is something, we're about to find out what secrets look like when they surface under legal compulsion instead of leaks. Either way, the era of questions being unanswerable is starting to end. So hold the shape for the last time. A crash story that started in 1933. An official lie provable from 1947. A documented ridicule machine from 1953. A nuclear pattern running 6 decades. A filing system built so that even admirables bounce off it. A wave of sworn witness, the system itself vetted. Money that has never once added up. And a Senate right now with subpoenas against the vault. Every piece of that sentence has paperwork, testimony, or a named claimant behind it. And every piece has its own episode, either in the past or coming up on this channel. You don't have to believe any conclusions today. You just have to admit the shape is there. And the shape, like this, doesn't stay buried for long, not with a deadline on them. Every episode promised today is coming. The Wilson Memo Forensics, Nuclear Series, the Ocean Series, the Money Trail, the big one, the Money Trail, the Missing Scientists. We are going to get through it. Subscribe now. This has been a really, really long episode. Sorry, guys. Subscribe now, because when November comes, we're going to be inside every little bit that drops. And as ever, if we've misinterpreted or misinformed, please let us know. Thank you so much for getting this far, for those of you that have. Please drop your questions, your comments, your opinions in the chat below. Well, let's talk about this. This has been a real sort of flag on the moon type episode. I've tried to lay out as much as we possibly can to give you a bit of history on the past on the channel and the future. Thank you so much for joining. Here are a couple of videos if you, for some bizarre reason, want to keep listening to my voice, and we will see you in the next episode.